You find out you're wealthy on a Wednesday. In a browser tab you almost closed by accident. The portfolio statement loads slower than it should. And for a second, you think it's an error, the kind of glitch that shows 6 extra zeros before correcting itself. It doesn't correct itself. You sit with the number for 11 minutes before you tell anyone, and the first person you think to call is Simeon, your closest friend since 9th grade, and then you don't call him. Not yet. You close the laptop instead, make a cup of coffee you don't finish, and go back to work. Like the morning is still the morning. It was 20 minutes ago. This didn't start with a windfall. It started 9 years earlier, in a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner. When your mother called to ask if you could cover $340 for a car repair she'd been putting off for 3 weeks. You could, barely, and you did. And you remember the specific feeling of being needed and being broke at the same time. A feeling that doesn't have a clean name, but sits somewhere between pride and dread. You were 26, working logistics for a regional freight company, making $41,000 a year, watching other people's businesses move through your spreadsheets without ever considering that you could own one. The idea came from a client, not a mentor. A pest control company in your territory kept missing invoices, kept losing routes to competitors, kept looking on paper like a business quietly failing. You noticed it the way you notice anything you're paid to track closely, not because you were looking for an opportunity, but because the numbers were sitting right in front of you for 18 months. Before it occurred to you they were also an option. You didn't have capital. What you had was a willingness to ask an uncomfortable question, which was whether the owner, a man in his 60s named Holt Pruitt, would consider seller financing instead of a bank loan you couldn't qualify for anyway. He said yes, mostly because nobody else had asked, and you signed a note for $68,000 against a business generating $110,000 a year in revenue, paying him back over 6 years out of the company's own cash flow, before you owned a single dollar of equity outright. This is the part nobody frames correctly when they talk about quiet wealth. It didn't feel like ownership, it felt like debt with a slightly different shape. And for the first 2 years, it was, you kept your apartment. You kept driving the same Corolla you'd had since college, the one with a check engine light that had been on so consistently, it felt less like a warning and more like a dashboard feature. Your girlfriend at the time, Odessa, asked once why you didn't upgrade anything. Now that the business was profitable, and you told her the truth, which was that the business wasn't done paying for itself yet, and every dollar it made was still walking straight back into Holt's note, and then, eventually, into the next acquisition. By 30, you'd paid off the pest control company entirely and used its cash flow to buy a second one, a lawn treatment business, 2 counties over. Again through seller financing, again from an owner who was tired and hadn't updated his invoicing system since 2004. You were not thinking about wealth. You were thinking about the next payment. The next route, consolidation. The next small inefficiency you could fix before a competitor noticed it too. The third business came at 33, a small commercial cleaning company servicing office buildings downtown, bought outright this time with cash. The first 2 businesses had generated. No bank, no seller note, just a wire transfer and a handshake in a parking lot outside a diner. This is the one that changed the math permanently, because for the first time, the income from all 3 exceeded your old freight salary by a factor of 4, and you made a decision that felt small at the time, but wasn't. You didn't tell anyone. Not Simeon, not your sister Farah, who was still renting a room in a house share at 31, and would have heard the number as either an accusation or a request. Not your parents, who still measured success in job titles. Not ownership structures they'd never been taught to recognize. You told your accountant, a careful woman named Petra Voss, because she needed the numbers to file correctly. And she became, without either of you naming it, the only person who fully understood what your life actually looked like underneath the Corolla and the one-bedroom apartment. You married Odessa at 34, in a courthouse ceremony that cost $340, including the license, not because you couldn't afford more, but because a wedding felt like the first place all of this money would become visible. And you weren't ready yet for visible. Her parents assumed you were struggling quietly, the way people assume when someone their daughter loves drives an old car and skips the destination wedding 2 of her cousins had. Odessa knew the real number. She'd seen the accounts. She never once suggested changing anything, and that more than the money itself, was the thing that convinced you the marriage would hold. By 36, the four businesses combined generated $840,000 a year in revenue, with roughly $310,000 of that flowing through as owner income after payroll, insurance, and equipment. You bought a house that year, a modest 4-bedroom in a neighborhood that didn't announce anything about the people living in it, paid in cash. A decision that took the mortgage question off the table permanently, but also removed the one visible marker, a mortgage payment, that would have told anyone watching how much you actually had. Instead, the house looked like every other house on the block, and the driveway still had the Corolla in it. Now with 141,000 miles. This is around the time Simeon started calling less. Nothing dramatic happened between you. There was no argument, no falling out you could point to and explain later. He'd started a construction business 4 years earlier. One that struggled through 2 slow winters and a lawsuit from a subcontractor. And every time you talked, the conversation drifted toward money in a way it never used to. Not because he asked directly, but because he'd mention a number, a bid he lost, a payment that came in late, and wait, almost imperceptibly, for you to offer something you never offered, not because you couldn't. 4 businesses generating $310,000 a year in owner income made $8,000, or even $20,000 a survivable, almost invisible expense. But because the one time early on you'd helped a different friend, Corbin, with $4,000 for a medical bill, the relationship never fully recovered its old shape. Corbin started introducing you differently at parties, as the friend who does really well, a phrase that sounded like a compliment and functioned like a wall. You learned slowly and expensively that money moving in one direction between friends rarely moves back as friendship. It moves back as distance, dressed politely. There was a dinner, the fall you turned 35, 6 of you at a table for a birthday, nobody remembers whose. And when the check came, someone suggested splitting it evenly instead of itemizing, the way the group always had. Your portion would have been $34 more than what you'd actually ordered, a difference too small to mention, and somehow too large to ignore, because saying nothing felt like performing wealth you weren't ready to admit to, and saying something felt like performing scarcity you no longer honestly had. You paid the $34, nobody noticed. You noticed for weeks currently. Researchers who study sudden and gradual wealth changes both point to the same pattern. Financial asymmetry inside a friendship almost always precedes emotional distance, even when neither person intends it. Nobody sits down and decides to drift. The drifting happens in the space between an unasked question and an unoffered answer, repeated often enough that it becomes the relationship's new shape. The direct ask finally came when you were 37, at Simeon's kitchen table, over coffee that had gone cold because neither of you was drinking it anymore. He needed $22,000 to cover a gap between 2 jobs, a bridge loan he'd already been denied by 2 banks because his construction business had inconsistent revenue on paper, even though it was in reality doing fine. He didn't ask you directly. He told you the number, the way people tell you a number when they're hoping you'll offer before they have to. You didn't offer immediately. You sat with it the way you'd once sat with your own number. 11 minutes of silence, disguised as sipping cold coffee. Before you finally said you'd think about it, you gave him the $22,000 2 days later, structured as a loan on paper. No interest, 6-month term. Because Petra insisted on documentation even for gifts disguised as loans. Simeon paid it back in full within a year. And still, something between you never returned to its old temperature. He started referring to you, once, to a mutual friend, as someone who had it easy, a phrase that landed harder than any insult because it erased 9 years of seller notes, of driving a car with a check engine light on principle, of turning down a wedding venue to protect a number he didn't know existed until the day he needed part of it. Farah found out differently, by accident. When a mutual cousin mentioned the house had been purchased outright, she called you that night, not angry, something quieter and worse than angry, and asked why she'd learned it from someone else. You didn't have a good answer. The truth, that you'd been protecting a version of normal you weren't ready to lose, sounded thin even to you once you said it out loud. She didn't ask for money. She asked why you hadn't trusted her enough to tell her the truth about your own life, and that question sat with you longer than any number ever had. This is what nobody explains about wealth, built slowly and kept quiet. It doesn't just separate you from strangers who might ask for a handout. It separates you from the specific people who knew you before, because every one of them is holding an old, accurate version of who you were, and the new version doesn't fit cleanly into any conversation you've already had 1,000 times. Not because they resent you, not because they're wrong to notice something's changed, because trust and money, once they tangle, rarely untangle in a way that leaves both people exactly as they were. The stress test came at 40, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Farah called from a hospital waiting room. Her daughter, 7 years old, needed a procedure their insurance wouldn't fully cover, a gap of $31,000 that had to be resolved within days, not months. Farah wasn't calling to ask. She was calling because she didn't know who else to call, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation, without deciding to, you told her the actual number, the one you'd been carrying quietly since the Wednesday 9 years earlier, because there was no version of protecting your privacy that mattered more than her daughter's procedure. You paid it that afternoon, from an account Farah hadn't known existed until she watched the confirmation come through on your phone, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and vending machine coffee. She didn't say thank you right away. She cried instead. The specific kind of crying that isn't relief exactly, more like grief for the version of the last 9 years, where she'd worried about you unnecessarily. While you were quietly capable of solving problems she never knew to bring you. After that day, Farah knew everything. Simeon still didn't. Not the real number, only the vague sense that you'd done well for yourself. A phrase he used carefully now, the way people handle something they've decided not to examine too closely. Your friend group, the 6 or 7 people who'd known you since your 20s, split quietly into 2 categories. Neither of them would have named out loud. The ones who stopped asking you for anything because they assumed you had it handled, and the ones who stopped calling altogether, not out of resentment, but because the friendship had been built on shared scarcity. And scarcity was the one thing you no longer had in common. By 38, the friend group's shared chat, the one you'd all used since college, had quietly stopped including you in anything beyond birthdays. Nobody removed you. You simply stopped being the person whose plans needed coordinating around. Because plans, at a certain point, stop being about affordability and start being about identity. And you no longer fully belonged to the identity the group had been built around in the first place. The formal milestone, the one a stranger might recognize as a rival, came the following year, when a regional consolidator offered $4.1 million for all 4 businesses combined. You sat in a conference room in a suit you'd bought specifically for the meeting, the first suit you'd owned in a decade, and listened to a man half your age describe your own life back to you in the language of EBITDA multiples and recurring revenue. You didn't sign that day. You didn't sign for 6 months, because the decision wasn't really financial anymore. It was about whether you were ready to become, on paper, exactly the kind of number Simeon had once accused you of already being. You eventually sold 3 of the 4 and kept the commercial cleaning company, the one that required the least of your time and the most of your patience. And the sale cleared $2, $9 million after taxes and fees, deposited on an ordinary Thursday that looked, from the outside, exactly like every other Thursday you'd had for 15 years. You didn't buy anything to market. You transferred most of it into the same conservative index funds Petra had been quietly recommending since you were 30. And you drove the Corolla, now retired to Odessa's parents' garage after 163,000 miles, to a diner, and ordered the same breakfast you'd ordered the morning you signed the first note with Holt. The sale made a small paragraph in the regional business journal, 4 sentences with your name in it, and within a week, Simeon texted for the first time in months. Saw the article, he wrote. Wish you'd told me sooner. You read it 3 times before answering, because the sentence contained an accusation dressed as an apology, and you understood, finally, that no version of timing would have made this easier for him. Not 9 years earlier. Not now. You wrote back that you were sorry it came out that way, and meant it, and also understood that sorry wasn't going to rebuild what 9 years of unspoken numbers had quietly worn down. You've thought about this often since, usually on ordinary evenings. The kind with nothing scheduled. When the mind drifts toward math, it doesn't need to redo. The friendships that survived weren't the ones where you gave the most or explained the most. They were the ones that had never been built on comparison in the first place. The ones where Odessa, or your accountant Petra, or eventually Farah could hold the number without needing it to mean anything about who they were by comparison. The friendships that quietly ended were never really about the money either. Not directly. They were about what the money revealed, which was how much of the original friendship had been standing on the assumption that you were all running the same race at the same pace. Currently, a lot of research on friendship and income mobility points to the same quiet conclusion, that most friendships are calibrated, consciously or not, around a shared sense of position. And when one person's position moves significantly, while the other's stays fixed, the friendship either finds a new calibration or it doesn't survive the recalibration attempt. Nobody warns you about this. When you're 26, staring at a struggling pest control company's invoices, thinking only about whether Holt would say yes to seller financing, nobody mentions that the real cost of the note wouldn't be the $68,000. It would be measured later, slowly, in phone calls that came less often, in group chats you got added back to only for weddings and funerals. You still think about the 11 minutes you sat alone with the number before telling anyone, the specific quiet of that Wednesday afternoon, coffee going cold, laptop finally closed. At the time, you assumed the silence was temporary, a pause before the real celebration, the real conversation, the real telling. It wasn't temporary. It became the shape of the next decade. And somewhere inside that shape, you lost a friendship. You didn't mean to lose and gained a closeness with your sister. You didn't expect to need. Simeon still texts occasionally, mostly about nothing. Football scores, a photo of his kids, and you answer. Because you're not interested in punishing him for a reaction that was underneath the specific words. An ordinary human response to an extraordinary gap. You don't blame him for it anymore. You've stopped expecting the people who knew you at $41,000 a year to instinctively understand who you became at $310,000 a year, then $2.9 million. Because understanding that shift requires information you spent 9 years deliberately withholding for reasons that felt protective at the time and only partially explained themselves in hindsight. Odessa asked you recently, on an ordinary Sunday, folding laundry in the same modest house you've lived in for 6 years, whether it was worth it. All that silence, all those years of the Corolla and the courthouse wedding, and the careful, deliberate ordinariness. You didn't answer immediately. You thought about Farah's daughter, healthy now, 7 years old, and unaware that a phone call in a hospital hallway had ever been a crisis at all. You thought about Simeon, still building, still occasionally texting, present in your life, in a smaller, more careful way than he used to be. You thought about the 4 businesses. 3 of them sold. 1 still generating quiet income every month. None of them ever photographed. None of them ever mentioned at a party. What you actually built wasn't a number. It was a specific kind of privacy, one that let you help the people who needed help without needing anyone's applause for having the capacity to do it, and one that also unavoidably cost you a friendship built on the assumption that you were all still running the exact same race.